Most people think they know why the Soviet Union collapsed. Some will point to Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, others to Ronald Reagan's arms race, and still others to the fall of the Berlin Wall as the decisive moment that sealed the USSR's fate. But what if all those explanations are missing the deeper truth? What if the real answer was not political, not military, not even ideological, but economic? What if the Soviet Union was doomed not because of who ruled it or who opposed it, but because its economy was like a machine built to run at full speed until the fuel ran out, and when it did, the machine simply broke down? Today we're going to dive into the hidden numbers, the systemic flaws, and the overlooked financial mechanisms that brought the Soviet Union, the second superpower of the 20th century, to its knees. We'll explore the origins of its economic model, its rapid rise, the turning points when cracks became visible, the breaking point of the 1980s, and the fallout that followed. And then we'll connect these lessons to our own time, because history may be repeating itself in ways we often don't notice. Stay with me until the end, because this story contains more than just the past. It contains warnings for the future.
To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we have to start by asking, how did it rise so quickly in the first place? When the USSR was officially created in 1922, it emerged from chaos. Years of World War I, revolution, and civil war had devastated the Russian economy. Industry had collapsed by over 80% compared to pre-war levels. Agriculture was in ruins, with famines sweeping the land. The country had barely any functioning financial system. The Soviet leadership faced a stark question. How do you rebuild a ruined empire into a modern state? Their answer was radical: central planning. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union launched a series of 5-year plans. These plans set precise targets for coal, steel, electricity, and other heavy industries. Resources were concentrated on massive industrial projects: hydroelectric dams, tractor factories, tank plants, steel mills. The state directed production, labor, and investment with little regard for consumer needs. And at first glance, the strategy worked. In just a generation, the USSR went from a largely agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. By the 1930s and 1940s, the country could build tanks, planes, and weapons at a scale that shocked the world. During World War II, this industrial capacity was crucial to defeating Nazi Germany. But there was a hidden price. Because consumer industries and agriculture were neglected, ordinary people experienced shortages. Clothing, housing, even basic food supplies were often inadequate. The Soviet model prioritized guns over butter, military power over civilian comfort. This imbalance was built into the very DNA of the system.
After World War II, the Soviet Union stood tall as one of 2 global superpowers. Its army occupied Eastern Europe, its scientists raced into space, and its influence extended across the globe. The economy once again was mobilized for geopolitical competition. Resources flowed into the arms race, into the space program, into nuclear weapons. The USSR amazed the world when it launched Sputnik in 1957 and put the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. Industrial output grew rapidly, and official statistics boasted annual growth rates that rivaled or exceeded those of the United States. To the outside world, it seemed the Soviet model might actually surpass capitalism. Western analysts worried about the Soviet growth miracle. In the 1950s and 1960s, some economists in the West even speculated that the USSR might overtake the US economy within decades. But beneath these headlines, cracks were already forming. The planned economy rewarded quantity over quality. Factories were evaluated on how many tons of steel they produced, not whether the steel was usable. Shoe factories were judged by how many shoes they made, not whether they fit people's feet. Bureaucratic targets created perverse incentives, leading to waste, inefficiency, and absurd production decisions. Most importantly, the consumer was nearly invisible in the planning process. While the US and Western Europe were experiencing rising living standards, booming consumer culture, and technological innovation in everyday life, Soviet citizens still struggled to find meat, fruit, quality clothing, or home appliances. Long lines became a normal part of life. People joked that in the USSR, everything was free, but nothing was available. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy increasingly relied on one thing: oil and gas. The global oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 caused prices to skyrocket. For the USSR, this was a windfall. Suddenly, billions of dollars of hard currency flowed into the Soviet treasury. Oil and gas exports provided the foreign exchange needed to import grain, buy Western technology, and support allies around the world. For a while, it looked like the Soviet model had found a lifeline. Growth continued, and the state could paper over inefficiencies by throwing oil money at them. But this created a dangerous dependency. Instead of reforming the economy to make it more efficient, the leadership leaned even harder on resource exports. Agriculture remained unproductive, industry stagnated, and innovation lagged behind the West. The USSR was living on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. Then came the collapse. In the mid-1980s, global oil prices fell dramatically, dropping by more than 2/3. For the Soviet Union, whose budget was heavily dependent on oil revenues, this was a financial catastrophe. Suddenly, there wasn't enough money to import food, to fund the military at previous levels, or to sustain the vast network of client states. At the same time, productivity growth had slowed to almost zero. The economy that once grew at 6 or 7% annually in the 1950s was now struggling to grow at 1% in the 1980s. Many sectors actually shrank. The Soviet Union, once an industrial giant, was stagnating.
When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized that the system was in deep trouble. His solution was Perestroika, restructuring. The idea was to introduce limited market mechanisms into the planned economy, give factories more autonomy, allow small cooperatives, open up some trade with the West. At the same time, Gorbachev launched Glasnost, openness, allowing freer discussion of problems. But here was the paradox. The Soviet economy was caught in a trap. Too much central planning made it rigid and inefficient, but introducing partial market reforms destabilized it even more. Prices, which had been fixed by the state, suddenly no longer reflected reality. Shortages worsened as people hoarded goods. Inflation exploded when hidden budget deficits surfaced. It was like trying to repair an airplane engine while flying at full speed. Every reform made new problems appear faster than old ones were solved. By the late 1980s, the ruble was collapsing in value. Stores were empty. Black markets thrived where goods were sold at prices ordinary citizens couldn't afford. The state budget was drowning in debt, and social trust, the belief that the system could deliver a better future, evaporated.
In 1991, the Soviet Union reached its breaking point. The economy was in free fall. Industrial output was declining. Agricultural production could not feed the population without massive imports. Hard currency reserves were almost gone. Inflation was raging. For ordinary people, it felt like the ground was disappearing beneath their feet. At the same time, the Soviet republics, Ukraine, the Baltics, Georgia, Central Asia, realized they might do better on their own. Economic imbalances had long existed,
some regions subsidized others. With the central budget empty, the glue holding the Union together dissolved. The political crisis of 1991, the failed coup, Gorbachev's weakening, and the eventual dissolution of the USSR was the visible event. But beneath it was an economic truth. The state could no longer pay its bills, feed its people, or sustain its empire. The collapse was not just political, it was financial.
Now comes the uncomfortable part. The lessons of the Soviet collapse are not confined to history. They echo loudly in today's world. Consider these patterns. Over-reliance on commodities. The USSR depended on oil exports. Today, many countries, from Venezuela to Russia itself, face the same trap. Prosperity when prices are high, crisis when they fall. Excessive military spending. In the 1980s, the USSR spent up to 25% of its GDP on defense. In contrast, modern developed economies typically spend 3 to 5%. When a state prioritizes guns over butter for too long, the population eventually rebels against sacrifice. Ignoring consumer needs. The Soviet system collapsed in part because people lost faith that it could improve their lives. Today, when governments neglect healthcare, education, housing, or jobs, they risk the same erosion of legitimacy. Debt and deficits. By the end, the USSR was borrowing heavily, running deficits that could not be sustained. Sound familiar? Many modern states struggle with ballooning debt, hoping growth will bail them out. The Soviet collapse is not just a story of communism. It's a warning about economics. Any system, capitalist or socialist, that ignores balance, efficiency, and the real needs of people is building on sand.
So what can we learn from the economic collapse of the Soviet Union? 3 powerful lessons stand out. Lesson 1. Economics comes first. No ideology, no army, no propaganda machine can survive if the economic foundation crumbles. Lesson 2. Resource dependency is a trap. Windfalls from oil, gas, or other commodities create illusions of wealth. But when the cycle turns, the consequences are devastating. Lesson 3. Legitimacy depends on people's daily lives. The Soviet Union could launch rockets, but it couldn't stock grocery shelves. When citizens stop believing the system can deliver for them, collapse is inevitable. A warning. History doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it rhymes. Today, we see echoes of these same mistakes across the globe. Governments relying too much on resources, spending too much on the military, ignoring public welfare, or papering over problems with debt. The Soviet collapse is not just about the past, it's about the future. Call to action. If you want to understand how economics shapes the fate of empires, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. Together, we can uncover the hidden laws of history and maybe avoid repeating the mistakes that destroyed one of the greatest powers of the 20th century.